I'd like to introduce Dr. Joy Kreider. You will find her very practical, down to earth. She has experienced trauma in her life. She's familiar with it. She's helped many people in learning how to deal with trauma. And I'm so glad that we're privileged to have her here to share with us. So the Lord bless you as you share.
Turn my sound. Yep, there it is. Thank you. And excellent. There we are. Well, it's a privilege and a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for coming out on one of those days where many of us don't have to work. Thank you for taking your time to be here today. I hope that you will hear some pieces in this talk that will be helpful to you personally, relationally, within our communities and our churches. So I come to you today wearing many hats. I come partially as a PhD level neuroscientist who used to study rats twitching in the warmth. Ask me about that another day. But I also come to you as a neuroscientist that's convinced that learning about how the brain responds to trauma, Scripture says the truth will set us free. And I believe that verse relates to the fact that when we have knowledge of how change occurs and that the change is deep and yet recoverable, that it helps us have empathy and compassion for ourselves and for other people in our lives who have faced trauma. I also come to you as a follower of Jesus who knows that he knows our griefs and our sorrows and that he cares and that he longs for us to find new wholeness. And finally, I come to you also as a trauma survivor who's on my own journey towards wholeness. And many of the things I teach to you today or talk about today are things that I have incorporated into my own understanding about what changes and what can we do to push that change back in a positive direction. I think out at the tables, there's an opportunity. If you would like a copy of the slides, and if you would like a copy of our second part today afternoon will be a bunch of experiential things. And if you would like a copy of those little skills and an explanation for actually why those skills work, if you leave your email address, we will see that you get both of those documents. And finally, in your packets is a set of notes. And it doesn't have absolutely everything on here that I'm going to say, but it kind of leads you through the information that you're going to receive today. And so you may not use them, but if you don't want to have to scribble madly to try to get everything down, which isn't really realistic, here's a way to help guide you. Maybe you can jot some notes as we go. Okay, here we go. So some definitions. So the other thing you're going to find out about me today is that me standing up here and lecturing at you for 6 hours is not a very good way for adults to learn. And so I'm going to ask you to do a bunch of pair and shares where turn to the person on your right or your left or turn behind. And I'm going to ask you to have a brief conversation and say what you think. And then we're going to come back together and I'm going to ask you, we call it popcorn. I'm just going to ask you to share some of what you heard or what you said about yourself. It really helps us, I think, understand some of the more complicated aspects of both trauma and resilience. So the first pair and share is going to happen right now. And I'm going to ask you to think about the sentence, resilience is like. Think about that for a minute. Share with your neighbor or speculate what you think you know about resilience. And then I'm going to have you come back in probably 6 to 10 minutes, 5 to 6 minutes, somewhere in there, and have you tell me some of what you heard or what you think about what resilience is like. All right, I turn it over to you. What is resilience like?
If you could just make sure and repeat what is said so that it goes across the
Yes.
board.
Gotcha. Who knew you had so much to say about resilience, right? All right, I'm going to call you back. And what did you hear or what did you say? What is resilience like? Elastic.
A bobber pushed down in the water.
A bobber. I like that. Pushed down in the water. What else?
Silly putty.
Silly putty. Oh, I like that one. I've never heard that either of these last two before. That's lovely. What else? 2 or 3 more.
Squishy ball.
Squishy ball. So watering my plants is a sign of resilience, right? The response to watering, which we need right now and don't have very much of. And somebody else said something about a tree.
Yeah, like a storm might be pushing it around, but afterwards it's coming right back to where it was.
Very good. Excellent. So elasticity, a bobber that gets pushed down and can pop back up, silly putty, a squishy ball, the ability to respond to watering, a tree that, I can't read my own writing, a tree that bounces back after a storm. These are all good definitions these are good definitions, and I'm sure there's more in the audience that we haven't heard. But one of the reasons I ask you to do this is because I think oftentimes when we bump into words like resilience and trauma, we feel like it's big, and I don't know. And I think actually most of us have some knowledge, some real world lived knowledge of our own experiences that help instruct us. And so, yep, I do have the PhD, but you have information to share and experiences that are relevant to your own traumatic experiences, to a family member, to a church member, to a community member. And so it's a way of honoring the fact that there's more lived knowledge in this room than sometimes we give ourselves credit for. All right, we're going to do one more, which is, in one sentence, what would you say trauma is like? What is trauma like? I give it back to you guys. Thank you. What is trauma like? A tornado.
When something is stretched beyond the point it can easily return.
Yes. When something is stretched beyond its ability to return to its original state.
Almost like it's on a loop that keeps getting played again and again.
A loop that plays over and over. Very good. An injury. Very good.
Like dumping 5 tons of rock on a half-ton pickup.
Love it. Dropping 5 tons of rock on a half-ton pickup. That's a significant load. 1 or 2 more.
Pain beyond or outside our control.
Absolutely. Pain beyond or outside our control. And part of the reason I'm saying these over, because it helps me to get it in my own head, but we're also doing this so folks that are listening online can also, we make sure that they hear all the comments. There was one more over here somewhere.
Drought or lack of basic needs.
Yes, drought or lack of basic needs. Excellent. Really good responses. Thank you, and thank you for your work. Another reason that I do this exercise is that when I think about resilience and trauma, I think about the fact that there are many, many lenses. There isn't a single definition that entirely encompasses all of the things that we may experience when we've been traumatized or when we've experienced threat or harm. And so I just think it's really helpful to immediately expand the room to say, hey, this is bigger than a single thing written on a page in a dictionary. Traumat. So someone said, I had to do this so I would remember to say it. Someone said an injury or a wound, trauma itself comes from a Greek word, traumat. And it means wound. And I didn't put these on the slides today, but sometimes I'll put pictures of a Band-Aid, a wound that's stitched, and a broken leg, because trauma comes in all forms and sizes. Even when we all are in the same situation, we aren't exactly affected exactly the same way. And so it's helpful to remember that there's breadth here, and as we think about how trauma affects us. Trauma is all around us. 1 in 5 people in the US have been sexually abused as children. 1 in 4 have been beaten by their parents. 1 in 3 marital partners, this is a staggering number to me, 1 in 3 engage in physical violence. 1 in 4 have grown up with alcoholic relatives, and 1 in 8 people have witnessed their mother being beaten. Trauma is all around us within our families, and we're not only focusing on familial violence or trauma today, but all of these things have to do with the other people that we're relating to as family. Trauma is all around us. 70% of Americans who are asked say that they've had at least one traumatic event in their lives, and we'll define what it means to say it's a traumatic event in just a second. 6% of the US population have been diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Given these numbers, what do these findings suggest to you about resilience? Resilience is necessary in that it's so common that we need it in order to move on and not just have our lives get blown apart. Is that where you're going? Yep. Any other comments?
There's probably a healthy way and an unhealthy way to be resilient.
Yes, absolutely. And also that many of us have strong capacity for resilience, because there's a bunch of us in this room, myself included, that is in at least one of these statistics, if not more than. So it suggests that that the human condition offers us the capacity for great resilience, even when we face really difficult things. And I always find that, to me, to be a hopeful message. It's possible. Okay, so people have been studying trauma at least 30 years, and there's sort of a set of things that most experiments and therapists and researchers agree upon, and I thought that you might find it helpful to just dip into some of those patterns. Again, it helps us understand what are the outer boundaries of trauma and resilience. So trauma is about threat and or harm. You don't actually have to be harmed to be traumatized. The threat of harm, being beaten once and told that that's going to happen every time that you disobey me, has great power and is traumatizing. It's typically unexpected, at least the first time we experience it, where there's repetitive harm that changes, but at least in the initial aftermath of the first time, it's unexpected. Typically, it's out of our control. Typically, it's unavoidable, and it overwhelms our coping capacity. Scale and impact, and it's sort of this first point is kind of a dovetail off the last one, overwhelming coping capacity. It's beyond our comprehension, and it pushes us past our ability to cope, and it pushes our brains past the ability to actually actively, meaningfully process the emotions, the actual experience, the changes that happen inside of me when I've had such an experience. The world is no longer a safe place. This is one of the things that everybody talks about, Bessel van der Kolk, in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is in your references in the back of your sheets, he talks about a husband and wife who, they were avid mountaineers. They hiked, they camped all the time. And they come back from a hike into camp, and I should go look it up again. I think it is that a mother and a cub bear are in their camp, which they don't realize until they get between the cub and the mom. And the mom does grave harm to both of those individuals. And in this case, the wife of that couple struggles with profound fear the rest of her life. There's no going back. It's a new normal. Now, it doesn't mean we can't push back against those effects, but real significant harm changes us in our brains. Bessel van der Kolk says trauma causes brain damage, and we'll take a look at that in just a little bit. That's true. The neurobiology of trauma, and we're going to do this a little more fully, but here's sort of the first pass. The effects that happen to us in our brains have to do with our threat detector, the amygdala, and we'll look at that more momentarily. One of the challenges so there's a guy named Sapolsky who wrote Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and if you want that reference, I can write it down for you. The trauma, the stress response of fight, flight, or freeze is put in our minds and our bodies and our brains to respond in the moment. And on the savannas in Africa, or here in Kansas, when a rabbit realizes that she is in the sights of a coyote or a wolf, you can fight, flight, you can run, you can freeze, or you can fight. If the rabbit doesn't get eaten, here's part of the story that they don't tell you. When it's safe, most animals, including big animals like gazelles, when it's gotten away from the predator, it literally falls over and it trembles all over its body. It does these really big, deep breaths, and it'll do that for a couple of minutes, and then it'll subside, and it'll get up and go back to eating grass or whatever it was doing before it encountered the predator. That's what the stress response was intended for. But if we're working for a very heavy-handed boss who criticizes us every day, if we're living in a situation where there's ongoing conflict with myself and others or other family members, the stress response system wasn't meant to be left on permanently. And when we get close to that, we have brain changes. And we'll look at that. In terms of the effects of trauma memories tend to be wordless. The amygdala tends to form memories in like sensory packets. And so if you read this literature at all, you'll hear about someone who has been harmed, and when they smell the aftershave of the person that harmed them, or they smell the perfume or the food that they were eating, they may actually have a full flashback, a full bodily response as if it's happening all over again. That's amygdala. It gets trapped in our bodies, and it takes time to get it out. But we'll look at some activities this afternoon which should be able to help you with that. And finally, brain structures really do change. Help me think about what causes trauma. What are the things that exist in our human lives that are threatening or harmful, are potentially unexpected or out of our control, and overwhelms our coping capacity? What causes trauma? What do you know about what causes trauma? And you can just shout it out. You don't have to raise your hand. We're not in school today. Death. Yes. Profound grief. And this is actually a new part of the trauma literature. Death of a loved one elicits in me a trauma response as if it's been me who's harmed. I don't sleep very well. I may feel shocky, sweaty. I might be irritated, or I might shut down and be zoned out for as long as I can because I don't want to feel anything. All of those things relate to the trauma response. What else? Say that one again. Rejection. Someone else said something. Accidents. What else? Abuse. Thank you. A long health crisis. Yes. Good one. Neglect. Absolutely. Here's a list. This isn't the total exhaustive list, but here are some of the things. All forms of violence. Things where I treat someone else differently because they have a quality that I don't trust or I'm afraid of or I dislike, like skin color, sexism, where I treat women harshly and I fawn to men, natural disasters of all kinds, fire, flood, drought, forced displacement, refugees who are forced to leave where home is and may be stuck in a refugee camp for years, harassment at work or harassment in our personal lives from a leader in our community, surgical experiences, long-term medical problems, colonialism, where we take an entire group of people and we say they're only good for one thing. I want oil out of that area of the globe, so I'm going to go in and I'm going to control that land. I'm going to get that land and I'm going to keep that land and I'm going to fight if anybody tries to take it off of me because I want that oil. No, this is a huge problem. Deep grief and deep shame are two of the most recent areas in trauma that are being studied, and both can elicit a trauma response. And then, are there setups? Are there things that make me more likely that I will be traumatized either now or in the future? I call them influencers. The presence or the absence of support is the one that's talked about the most. If I am in a vehicle accident, but the EMTs are there immediately and someone's holding my hand even while they're trying to get me out of the vehicle, and you are okay and you're not bleeding out, you're not dying, we're here, we're going to help you. The presence or absence of support has a huge impact on whether or not people have a long-term trauma response. The vulnerability of the victim, the adult Joy who maybe has a boss who pick, never ever quite, I'm never good enough, I never do things exactly the way she or he wants me to, versus me, the child, who's harmed by my parents. Children are more vulnerable than adults. Children have fewer choices. The adult Joy can choose, I'm not going to work for that person anymore. I'm done, I can't take it. Kids don't have that choice when it's happening, especially at home or school or in the community. The severity of the event, right? Having every house blown away by a tornado for an entire town versus I experience a fire in one part of my house, but it's fully repairable. The severity of those events are pretty different. And the presence of previous traumatic experiences. This one is most evident if you look at the veterans literature and discover that the men and women who come home with really strong post-traumatic responses to what they experienced, many, maybe not all, but many of them have some form of childhood abuse or neglect in their background. It can set us up to be traumatized more strongly when new harms happen. Questions? Throughout our time together, you can stick your hand up, and if I don't notice it, just start talking. I'll do my best to notice, but yeah, you can stop me if I say something that doesn't make sense. So, post-traumatic stress disorder, most of us in here are not going to go off and diagnose someone But I think it's actually helpful to see the symptomology because it also helps us understand how we are affected, even if we don't ever develop PTSD. If a really shocking, harmful thing happens, there's a good chance that we will have a portion of these responses. I have a major event that happens, and guess what? It doesn't even have to happen to me. If my child is in a very difficult accident, or I discover that my friend has been abused at work, I may also actually begin to have the same symptoms. And this is most relevant for those of us who work in the helping professions. I talked to a bunch of Child Protective Services staff in Virginia last Tuesday, and the 3 different people asked me about secondary or vicarious trauma, which is a trauma response to someone else's harm. It's not my own. Typically, we will re-experience the traumatic event. We might have nightmares, we may have full-body flashbacks. If we see something around, if I smell the perfume or I smell the food that was being cooked while I was being harmed, I may have little bits and pieces of that memory that pop back up to the surface. Active avoidance of trauma-related thoughts or feelings. And so if I was in a vehicle accident and I'm never going to get back in the vehicle again, and when my spouse says, you know, honey, you really need to drive again because I can't take you to work every day, I push away anything that reminds me of what happened to me in the first place. Negative alterations in mood, self-blame, depression, a sense of isolation, and you're going to see a much larger list of this in a little bit. Definitely, we move towards the negative side of things, and we're feeling bad, we're feeling sad, we're feeling anxious. Changes in physiological or emotional arousal and reactivity. So emotional arousal, emotional regulation is a big piece of what changes for trauma survivors. I didn't used to get angry at anything, and now I'm angry all the time. I didn't used to want to be by myself in a room that's dark and there's no sensation, and now I want to do that all the time. These sorts of changes in what's happening inside me and even what I crave in order to feel safe and like I'm away from the problem, these are changes that happen for most people who've been traumatized. In the diagnostical statistical manual, which psychologists and psychiatrists use to diagnose PSD, these symptoms have to last more than a month. And these changes also have to impact our ability to function. I start taking sick days because I can't face the chaos of the office. It makes me super anxious now, and I wasn't anxious before. Even when PTSD is not diagnosed, these sorts of symptoms can crop up at least for a time. And if you are someone who is in a helping profession, one way to be aware of whether or not you might be moving towards secondary trauma is to think, in my life, is there anything right now that I'm avoiding all the time? Am I dreaming about violence that might be related to the violence that someone has shared with me? This list is actually a way of sort of measuring for us, how am I doing internally with the fact that I hear hard stories all the time? It's worth paying attention to. And I just said that even for us who are not psychologists, it's just really worth listening to the inner processes that are happening inside of me and what does it tell me about how I'm really doing. So sometimes people get really confused about trauma and they don't know where it fits in the larger scheme of our functioning. And so, sorry, I'm a little bit off the page there, but it works. The demands of the day. So there was a physiologist in 1950 who said, you know, the word stress isn't only bad. The word stress is also good. And he described what he called eustress. In the morning, when we get up, we know there's things we need to do. my job, my kids, and we have many other responsibilities. If we're working at home, if we're working on the farm, there are things that have to happen, and they pull me out of bed and into my day. Interestingly, part of what helps us do that is the chief stress hormone called cortisol. Cortisol is at its highest peak naturally in my body without any trauma right before I wake up in the morning. And it's at our lowest peak right before we go to bed at night. Cortisol actually helps set the stage for waking up and getting going and doing the things I need to do. So some stress, some demands upon our time, some responsibilities that we have help push us from day to day in a very good way. And so assuming that every form of stress is going to cause us trauma isn't a helpful way to think about it. And this is just a way to sort of contrast and compare what happens in my normal day-to-day. What about distress? Distress, things are getting a little heavier. I'm experiencing, I just feel so exhausted at the end of every workday partially because there's conflict and I can't resolve it, but I have to work next to it. I'm not as effective. I'm starting to forget the things I'm supposed to do at home and at work. I might be feeling anxiety when I literally go to work. And I did as a graduate student, especially if there were other things happening. This isn't true for everyone, but for me, I went into therapy forever to deal with the harm that had been done to me. And when I was really anxious, if I had a flashback and I was really pushed emotionally, it was also very difficult to go to work and cope with any other conflict. There was less of me around already to cope with what was happening at work. We might be in situations where we feel sad a lot. And as I said, pushes our capacity to cope. And examples, someone said it earlier, I think, and it would be an example, is living with long-term illness. Where you are, I have several friends who have MS, and my friend who's a professor is tracking sort of her inner cognitive ability all the time. Am I losing words? Am I able to give my lecture without having to stare at my notes, which is what I used to do before MS developed in my body and my brain? Working in long-term, ongoing conflict situations and then surrounding chaos and surrounding violence. Living in a poor neighborhood where there are shootings regularly at night. Living in a war-torn situation where at any moment I might actually have to pack what I can carry on my back and get out of town. Living with, I used to pray at night that my parents would stop fighting downstairs. Living with surrounding chaos puts a heavy strain on our emotions, on our brain and our bodies. Trauma. I can't protect myself or my loved ones. My spouse is alcoholic, and when he comes home really angry and drunk, we lock ourselves in the bedroom and pray. Stuff that is beyond my control, a very critical boss that's constantly making comments. And there's other people in my work setting that actually seem to notice that that's true, but they don't know how to help me, and I feel stuck, and I feel harmed. And I'm stuck in a situation that I can't get out of. Those are some aspects. What's interesting is that there is sort of an additive portion. Sorry, I hit the wrong one. Here we go, I'll go back, there we go. Try to use my laser point, it's a danger. I feel stressed. This can add up over time and actually take us into a traumatic response. It doesn't always happen to every person, but sometimes people talk about trauma with the big T and trauma with the little t, and I've never been terribly fond of that because I think it devalues whatever the experience is that makes me traumatized. But having to face these things long term, Yep, they can take us beyond our ability to cope. Yes.
What do you have to say about broken relationships, especially like divorce or even like a friendship that you were intending to
Yes.
share for life and that,
And it's broken.
yeah.
Yeah, that's another form of chaos. And it could be that the person, you might not have done anything wrong, but I said something that someone else took the wrong way, or, yeah. So because of my work, I'm aware that I can't have a lot of frail friends who are like dipping in and out of anxiety and depression. I have to have friends that are a little more stalwart around me because I'm walking with other people who are fragile all the time. So yes, those things can be so hurtful and anxiety and depression producing and can take us towards being traumatized. Yeah.
So when do you know that you've reached
The magic question, right? This is the billion-dollar question. I would say that if some of those symptoms we talked about, if I'm starting to dream about, or if I'm having intrusive thoughts, like I just want to walk up, and this has happened to me, and I'm betting it's happened to some of you, I want to go up to that person and tell them what for right now. Stop it. Leave me alone.
what about self-harm?
Self-harm, absolutely. Or wanting to harm them, having violent fantasies about doing harm to somebody else because you want to get away from the chaos that is producing this anxiety. Yeah, absolutely. All of those things. Yeah. Good question. Okay, this is another share, pair and share. Think about 2 examples of eustress that actually help you get up and moving through your days in your life. And think of 1 example of distress. Talk with your neighbor for a few minutes, and I'll bring us back to hear a reporting in on what those are. 2 examples of normal eustress in your life, 1 example of distress in your life. Okay, it's all yours. let's come back together. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand. My sound person in the back is very gracious. Examples of eustress in your life. We're going to break them up and do them separately. Examples of good stressors that are just part of getting me through my day, my week, my work, my life.
Providing for those we care for.
Yes, absolutely. Providing for those we care for. Work appointments. Yes, absolutely. Getting my kids ready for school. I think it's one of the most underappreciated tasks that parents do. Am I not right about that? Very good response. A couple more.
Work and home responsibilities.
Yes. And maybe even balancing work and home. How do I want, that it's challenging. Well,
Caring emotionally for the people I love that are close to me.
yes, caring emotionally. There was a question over here about, how do I help without ending up being kind of overwhelmed and distressed myself? And we will talk some more about that this afternoon. Do you want to ask the question you asked me? Do you remember? You asked me about, didn't you, let's see, did you?
Is there a healthy level of distress? Is distress always bad? I mean,
Good question.
Seems like a bad thing, but where does distress fit in that?
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful question, partially because there is a lot of wiggle room here. We don't have exactly numbers. When my boss says the harsh thing for the 10th time, my prefrontal cortex explodes and I'm traumatized. And we are going to live with some levels of distress, right? Colicky babies, a vehicle that keeps breaking down, a job that I thought was going to be one way and it ends up being something very different, and it's really not very much fun. And I guess for me, when I think about how do I know if I'm traumatized or not, is that I go back to the diagnosis listing, but also we're going to look at something called the window of tolerance today, this afternoon. And the elements that make up hypoarousal, hyperarousal, and window of tolerance. If I have lots of things that are taking me out of my normal ability to cope and push me towards, we're definitely moving towards trauma. That's when distress is layers are adding upon each other. Yep. Okay. If you are willing to be honest enough, let's see, levels of distress. Maybe I should share one myself. I am training you today, meeting with you today in the midst of meeting with donors. And a major donor last year, as I left Iowa, and that's where I just was very unhappy with, I don't get it. Working with traumatized children, or adults, I don't really get what you're doing. And she cut her gift in half, and I actually came fully assuming they would not support me this year. And I had a lot of angst about that and knew at some point we were going to have that conversation, and that definitely I was carrying a level of anxiety until we finally had a chance to process it and I could own myself. That was your question, and I didn't have a great response, but also here's what I'm doing now as I build and as I begin to reach more people. And that was what she really wanted to hear, and they were very happy to increase their gift and stay on board with me. So things like finances can be extremely distressing. What else depletes energy, decreases your effectiveness, produces anxiety or depression for you? I went first, so you have to go now.
Broken relationships.
Broken relationships, absolutely. What else? Children's choices. Yes. Very true. Constant pain, meaning physical pain. Indeed.
Inability to meet people's expectations.
Yes. inability to meet people's expectations. Excellent. Yes. Being avoided by those we love. One or two more. Work we don't enjoy, indeed.
How did Jesus cope with the stress in his life?
Do you have an answer, or are you asking me? You don't have an answer?
I do, but I'd like to hear from others.
Are there responses? How did Jesus respond to stress in his life? Retreats into the mountains. Good boundaries. He sweat drops of blood.
In Peter, it says that when he was reviled, he reviled not again, but committed himself to him who judges righteously.
He didn't take retaliation
And committed it to the Father.
and committed it to the Father. Not an easy task. Other comments? Indeed. It's not always about retreating to the mountains. That's safer. Absolutely. And he wept. He wept over Jerusalem. He wept. It makes me weep that he wept at Lazarus' tomb. He knew he could raise that guy from the dead, but he still had this deep, compassionate response. Very powerful. Great question. You want to come up and ask some more? Thank you. That was a great question. All right, onward to the autonomic nervous system. And we will take a break in about 25 minutes. So, the brain has at least two different systems. One system that wakes us up and gets us going, our gas pedal. And cortisol levels rising just before I wake up in the morning actually helps us to do what we need to do. And the gas pedal also goes to the floor when I'm facing the angry bear in the woods. But there's another equal system, the brake pedal or the parasympathetic nervous system, which you don't have to remember that term for sure, pushes us towards rest and digest. And in a day-to-day fashion, we move from being activated enough to do all the things we need to do, and then coming back down for a little bit. Maybe at lunchtime, I get to just cool my jets, at least for a few minutes, and then we drive up again, and then we come back down. This daily rhythm is set by a bunch of different things in the body and the brain. But it's worth knowing because when we think about how to heal or how to respond to how trauma's impacted us, especially the brake system, the brake pedal is very important, and we will look at that more in just a little bit. Our stress response to harm or to threat. It is mediated by two structures, and there's other structures that contribute, but for the sake of a one-day conference, we're going to look at the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is here. If you cover your forehead with your hand, you're covering over prefrontal cortex. And the amygdala is a very deep structure. If I stick my finger in maybe about 3 inches, I would touch my amygdala. These structures help us when we face threat. What changes when we face threat? In the brain, we make more cortisol, we make more adrenaline, which increases our alertness and focus and increases intracranial blood flow, and you'll see blood flow out in the body as well that changes. Brain-related changes to that mother bear in the woods also increases other brain chemicals that prepare us to respond to threat in some meaningful way. In the body, our breathing rate, our respiration rate increases. We have a heightened sense of smell. We have a heightened focus to respond to things that are coming at us potentially. Pupils dilate, so my central vision is enhanced. Blood pressure increases, heart rate increases. There's increased blood flow to our muscles, and actually the digestion, the blood flow that supports digestion is actually shunted away to my muscles so that I can respond to whatever the threat is that's coming my way. And in order to talk about brain data, we first need to discuss, this is not a great note to me, sorry, let's just go there. The brain and how it experiences and what happens when we have experiences. This is as far as we'll delve into sort of the structure, the microstructure of the brain. Our brain is full of billions of neurons, some of which look something like this. Oop, did it again. A message, so let's say my eye sees a beautiful tree. Well, that information goes back out the optic nerve and up into the brain. And that message of the beautiful tree is actually carried by individual cells. I'm not going to use my laser pointer anymore. The dendrites is what receives that electrical message. The message travels the whole way down the axon, and at the end, it drops these tiny little drops of chemical that can be bound up by the next neuron over, and it passes that message. So it's message, 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 going to all over different places in the brain. They are one of the major building blocks. There's another group called the glial cells, but we're not going to talk about them today. Interactions between neurons changes as our experiences change. And some of these changes occur at the synapse. So stronger connections grow larger and longer, and I'll show you a picture of that, and weaker connections grow smaller. The shrinking and the expanding in the brain, a former colleague recently demonstrated that changes are made as rapidly as a few seconds. Her data is, in rat brains, we were able to watch neurons and glial cells get bigger and smaller depending on what was happening. It's really, really quite amazing. Our brains are amazing, amazing things. So what happens when there's trauma? Well, in order to talk about that, it's helpful to talk about some animal literature, and that's my background. I worked with geckos and rats and mice and golden cerium hamsters and rabbits. I really hate rabbits, and I love rats. It's really true. Did you know you could give a baby rat CPR with your pinky or lightly with your forefinger? I used to do that as part of my work. It's crazy. All right, chronic stress, as you already know, is strongly associated with anxiety and depression in humans. As it turns out, chronic stress also changes animal behavior. Like if I put an animal in a situation where in the middle of their sleep cycle, when the vivarium or in the animal room where the rats are kept, instead of it being dark, it goes bright all of a sudden, and there's flashing lights and there's loud rock music playing. And I turn a switch on, and their bedding, where they usually sleep, slowly fills up with cold water. This is extremely stressful to rats. You can actually measure their cortisol response. They have corticosterone, but it's basically the same hormone. And this is extremely stressful. It's also very stressful to put rats in restraint. So putting them inside a little tube that they can't get out of is also very, very stressful. And these two mechanisms, surprising animals with really distressing stimuli for 3 weeks in a row, or putting them in restraint stress for an hour every day for a month, has impact on the nervous system that we can measure. So, parts of the brain shrink and parts of the brain grow. what happens is that if you can compare, I know it's not a great picture, but if you look at the unstressed, this is a neuron from the prefrontal cortex, like that cartoon we looked at, and this is a neuron that is from a stressed animal. Those dendrites, those things that point out the top, there are fewer of them and they're not as long, which means they have fewer connections to other neurons. And if you keep some of those animals and now return them to normal environment where daylight and dark circle is what it's expected and there's no water and I'm not putting them in restraint. Actually, if you look at, oh, wait a minute, I got to back that up. So prefrontal cortex dendrites shrink, which means they're not as strong, and amygdala dendrites grow. And so if you compare the control to the animal that was stressed in some way, there's more of everything, right, on both ends of the neuron. Trauma causes real brain damage in the brain, in our brains, and in the brains of rats and rabbits and other animals that have been impacted. Prefrontal cortex and amygdala change in response to high stress. They shrink or they expand at the synapse. And very basically, at least some of the ways that I form memories is because those connections that are most active actually grow. And so this memory and the way we function is deeply related to what our neurons are doing in relationship to our experiences. If you take, the good news is, if you take a rat and put him back in a normal routine, maybe you stressed him for a month, now we're gonna give him a good situation for a month, the trouble reverses. Amygdala gets a little smaller and prefrontal cortex gets a little bigger and has more synapses. And that's a really good thing because the amygdala actually is held in check by messages that come from prefrontal cortex that keep us from feeling constant levels of anxiety, constant levels of panic, hypervigilant. I'm waiting for the next shoe to drop, and I'm gonna drop behind my chair when it does. I am ready because I am stressed out maximally. There are changes in our brain when we face significant stress. This is like the perfect place to take a break.